harder, right? There's more complicated transformation because there's addition and a multiplication in there. And you need to come up with the corresponding points on the transformed function without being given the x values like you were in number 1. So my parent function, so h of x is -1/2 square root of x plus 2. What's the parent? What function is being transformed here? Square root x. So we start by just identifying square root x. So I'm just going to plot some points on the square root of x by making an xy chart. So I've given you some x values, and the y values are just the square root of them. And so the square root of 0 is 0, square root of 1 is 1. Yeah. Why isn't it plus or minus? Isn't the square root of a number plus or minus? It's not. It's not actually. Unless there's a plus or minus outside the square root, when you just write square root, it means just the positive one. So this is just the positive square root function. So the square root of 4 is 2, square root of 9 is 3, 16 is 4, and the square root of 25 is 5. So let's plot those points so I can see what the square root function looks like. 0, 0, 1, 1, 4, 2, 9, 3, 16, 4, and 25, 5. Connect those with a nice smooth curve. So this is f of x equals square root x. All right, now I haven't even looked at the transformation yet. Now I'm going to look at it and try to think about what the changes that I've made to the formula will do to the points and to the graph in general. So that -1/2 on the outside, is that changing the x or the y? Outside the square root. Vertical, horizontal, y or x? Y, yes. Yeah, so if it's under the square root inside the function, if it was next to the x within the square root, then it's changing x. Outside the square root, it's changing y. So that -1/2 is a vertical shrink by a factor of 1/2. And the negative means it's going to reflect over the x-axis. So this is both a vertical shrink and a reflection, oops, over x-axis. And it doesn't matter which one I do first. Multiplying by -1/2 will shrink and reflect, or reflect and shrink, and it'll come out the same. Okay, and then the +2 that's inside the function, I'm adding that 2 to the x value. What's that going to cause in terms of my graph? It's going to shift left 2. Okay, so my y values are going to get multiplied by -1/2. And my x values, I need to, in order to move left 2, I would subtract 2. So for my x values, I'm going to start by subtracting 2. So instead of 0, I've got -2. Just looking at the x values in the parent function, subtract 2 from all of them. -3, 4, oops, sorry. 1 minus 2 is -1. 4 minus 2 is 2. 9 minus 2 is 7. 16 minus 2 is 14. And 25 minus 2 is 23. So I've changed the x values appropriately. Now I want to change the y values. So for each of these y's that I have on the parent, I'm going to multiply them by -1/2. So 0 times -1/2 is still 0. 1 times -1/2 is -1/2. 2 times -1/2 is -1. 3 times -1/2 is -1.5. 4 times -1/2 is -2. And 5 times -1/2 is -2.5. So these are the corresponding points on the transformed function. I took each x and moved it left 2, and I took each y and multiplied by -1/2. And now if I plot those points, got -2, 0, -1, -0.5, 2, -1, 7, -1.5, 14, -2, and 23, -2.5. So you can see overall, I made a vertical shrink. So this is like shorter than it used to be. Also reflected it over the x-axis and moved it left too. Before we move on, I want to check that I did it all right. I'm going to use technology to make sure that this is all right. Okay, so I'll plot my parent first. I have f of x equals square root x. The abbreviation in GeoGebra for square root is SQRT. So there's my square root function. Just gonna maybe show a little bit more of the x values because ours went to 25. And then my transformed function g of x was -1/2 times the square root of x plus 2. And so I've got g graphed in red here. Does that look like what we did? Yeah. So you can very easily check all of your work before you hand this in and know if you got 100.